Hello ladies and gentlemen, this is Mr. Reese. I just wanted to give you a quick video just talking about the prelude to the American Revolution. So with that being said, let's get started. Alright, so today we're going to be talking about the prelude to the American Revolution, and the central historical question we're going to be trying to answer is what events led to the American Revolution? So with that being said, let's get started. Alright, so the first thing we gotta do is just contextualize this whole entire thing, and when it comes to this, we're going to be talking about two different things. The first of which is the Age of Exploration, and how it actually leads to the European colonies in America. Now, as you can see, there are three main countries that we see here: Britain, France, and Spain. Now, Spain is there, but don't get too involved with them. The two that we're going to be taking a lot of time on is France and Britain. So those two are the ones that we're going to be actually talking about. Now, with that being said, we're also going to be talking about their fight over different territories, okay? Specifically in the French area where we get Indiana and Illinois and all the different Midwestern states. Who would have thought that there were people that would fight over the Midwest? Crazy, I know, right? So with that being said, there is one side note that I do want to mention here, and that is that the Native Americans traded with the French, specifically fur pelts and everything. You gotta remember the French are very fashionable, and they really appreciate that. So they're gonna trade with the Native Americans, and therefore have somewhat of a treaty, to say the least, when it comes to them. So moving on a little bit more, we got to talk about the conflict over the different territories, which is what we call the French and Indian War, or the 7 Years' War, or whatever you want to call it. Okay, so when it comes to this, we're going to be talking about this. Now, 7 Years' War, how many years did it actually last? It actually lasted 9 years. There was about 9 years of conflict, 2 of which were at the very beginning when they actually didn't declare war with each other, and yeah, that happened, and then you had the 7 Years' War, or 7 years after that, which hence the name of it. So that being said, they were fighting over the expansion of territory, and British and French were fighting each other. Now, the one thing that I want you to know is that the British ended up winning, and with that they ended up taking a lot of control of North America. Now, George Washington, as you see, is a British emissary at this time period, and he does get promoted to a higher rank in the military. So a little bit about George Washington and where he came from militarily wise. So moving on a little bit more, we have the big idea, and this is the one thing I want you guys to understand, is that this war happened. But the problem is that wars always cost money. And the way that they actually get that money is going to be very, very slow, because war debts just don't get paid all in one lump sum. They actually get paid over time. Okay, so much so that the French really didn't have that much time to actually pay back Britain for their reparations and everything along those lines. We'll talk about that a little bit more and why it actually matters. With that being said, this war debt actually leads to a lot of taxes that we see in the American colonies. Okay, so the first two that we see are going to include the Sugar Act and the Stamp Act, and I'll get to that in a little bit. But the Sugar Act it was the first tax that was actually utilized in the Americas, I should say. They taxed more than just sugar, as the name actually says. They taxed other things that could contain sugar, which would include coffees and wines. And the one thing that's really interesting is molasses, and why molasses is such a bigger deal. Molasses, if you heat it up, you actually get some sort of liquefied version of it. And when you liquefy this, it actually leads to it being fermented, and hence becomes an alcoholic drink. Now, you guys know this alcoholic drink as rum. Now, molasses and rum are going to be two of the major things that the Americans use to actually export out of their colonies. And when, they tax this, prices rise, and the Americans end up getting a very, very big decline in their economy because of this. Okay, so the tax on molasses leads to a rum shortage, and therefore leads to the decline of the American colony, or the American economy, I should say. Moving on a little bit more, we get the Stamp Act. Now, the Stamp Act happened in 1765, which is a year after the Sugar Act, And as you guys know, it tax stamps. Now, you may be like, why is that a big deal? Okay, everything has a stamp on it. Everything that you get gets a stamp. You buy something and there's a stamp that goes along with it. So just give you kind of an idea about that. Now, this leads to Patrick Henry, a famous writer and a speech giver, as it will say right here. He actually talks about the anger that American colonists are feeling during this time. Alright, he says things like, give me liberty or give me death, and also the idea of this, if this is treason, make the most of it. He says these words, and these words ring very true for a lot of Americans, and therefore will actually lead to a lot of them becoming, part of this revolution because of how angry they actually are. So moving on, they end up still taxing a lot more 2 years later with the Townshend Acts. Alright, British Parliament actually tries to assert that imports from Great Britain are to be taxed. So the imports actually lead to a couple of things being taxed, but the one import that the Americans are really angry about is tea. Okay, tea being taxed is very, very hard on the Americans because it just not allowed American colonists to actually sell this tea. All their tea had to come from Great Britain, and therefore, declining the American economy even more. Okay, so Americans had a really, really, really hard time, and what they ended up doing is smuggling tea, and Britain actually caused them to actually, cut off everything. Now, this taxing of tea and all this other stuff leads to a bunch of issues in Boston. Alright, the first one being the Boston Massacre, as you see in the image right here. This is definitely a POV type of situation where we see, the poor colonists actually being fired upon. They feel as if like this is a massacre. Well, what ended up happening is that boycotts were taken to the streets because of all these acts that were being imposed on the American people. And so the British actually sent a bunch of soldiers. Now, when they sent a bunch of soldiers, they ended up sitting there and they ended up corralling all these people, and the people ended up overcrowding or overwhelming the British people, so they ended up retreating. And when they retreated into this little kind of street, it was actually a dead end. So these Americans ended up throwing snowballs at the British soldiers. Now, these aren't your stereotypical snowballs where it's just powder. You see rocks being put into these snowballs and just a bunch of other things. On top of that, the people from the upper levels started throwing pots down of different plants, and this really angered the British, to say the least. Okay, so they ended up firing back. It was the angriest of all snowball fights that you could possibly say. And as we all know, there is 5 people who died, one of which being Crispus Attucks. Okay, the African American at this time. Actually, no, it's not African American. A black person in America, because they are not considered American just yet. Okay, so another thing that ends up happening is the Boston Massacre, as you can see from the image here. Okay, or not the Boston Massacre, the Boston Tea Party. Alright, so when it comes to the Boston Tea Party, what ends up happening is that the American people ended up dressing up like Native Americans and poured about 92,000 pounds of tea into Boston Harbor, if you're from Boston at all. By the way, if you ever go to Boston, it is so much fun. They have such cool things. The accent is awesome. It's one of the best accents I've ever heard. But I digress. But the Americans wanted goods to be from America. It wasn't that they were trying to make the British poor or anything like that. They wanted to show that they want American products, not British products that are imposed on them, that we see from Townshend Acts and the Boston Tea Party. So the British actually do retaliate, and this does lead to a little bit of a scuffle, to say the least. So how they retaliate is from something called the Coercive Acts of 1774. Basically what they did is that British Parliament responded to the Boston Tea Party and decided to quote-unquote tame the American colonists by closing the Boston harbor, making sure that they aren't able to actually export any more goods out of Boston, and they also imposed something called the Quartering Act. Because of all this hostility that the Americans were giving the British, they ended up sending more soldiers, so much so that they needed places to stay because they were running out of places to, camp in. Okay, now one thing that I do want to mention is that they did not actually sit there and force people to, let soldiers come into their homes. If they decided not to let soldiers into their homes, they had to pay a fee and a tax on that to actually house them. Okay, and hence why we get the idea of the Quartering Act. Okay, so the Americans are like, well, this is a lot of stuff that they are making us do. So what they do is that they end up deciding that they need to have a conversation with Britain, and the way that they're going to figure this out is in a Continental Congress, okay, the first of two Continental Congresses. Now, when they do this, they go into a place called Lexington and Concord, as many people know, and when they do, they end up having to fight off the British, all right? They kind of knew that the British were coming. Sam Adams, you guys know that, or Paul Revere, I should say, you guys know the whole thing. But basically what ends up happening here is that they were just wanting to talk about how to even attempt to talk to the British. Now, that being said, the British ended up, going down there and thinking that they were going to start a revolution against the British and that they were trying to, disband themselves from the British Empire. So they sent a bunch of soldiers down, as the nice image looks like. Alright, and basically what ends up happening is that there is a confrontation, someone shoots, and that's where we get the first shot heard around the world and also in the American Revolution. So that is that. Alright, pretty easy to remember when it comes to all this, all the different events. If you guys have any questions or concerns, please let me know. Send me an email or different things like that. And with that being said, I am done. Have a great day. Bye.